Okay, this is your turn your time to ask questions and to try to wrap up and synthesize what we've heard and what we've felt over the last 2.5 days. We have all the panelists here, everyone who has spoken to you. I would just make one note. Cynthia is going to have to leave a little bit early, so when she leaves, it's not because she disagrees with what Whit says. It's just that she has to leave to get back to her family.
Or because I've pinched her.
No,
In any case,
will not be my response to that.
Moving right along, I was introduced at the break to a very impressive young man whose name is Sikandar Ahmadi, and he's studying at the Gould Academy. He's been admitted to Williams College, a great, great college in Massachusetts, for next year, and he's from Kabul, and he sat through this entire weekend listening to people talk about his country. I thought we should give Sikandar the chance to ask the first question and say whatever he'd like. And there he is, right up in the balcony.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sikandar Ahmadi, as you heard, and I am from Afghanistan. I came to Gould Academy last year, and I'm off to college next year. I've been very, very impressed, and I can't express how delighted I am and how much impressed I was by the speakers and by the enthusiasm of the people in general here who are willing to listen and who are looking, to solve the problems in Afghanistan and to help us out there. And I express my deep gratitude to you, to the American people, and to the United Nations, to NATO, and to the global world who are helping us right now. And I know that this help and this type of focus that is there in Afghanistan now has not been there years before and before 2001. And I very much appreciate the current and the present focus of the world. To ask my question, I asked the whole panel. My first question is that I've heard that we're now moving towards a policy that's more based on negotiations for the next years. And I want to hear from you your comments about whether the Afghan people, the civilians, are ready to accept these negotiations, because we have seen the brutality of the Taliban, a totalitarian or a really extreme regime in Afghanistan, and I've been part of this, and I endured the pain with my family, and I want to hear your comment on that. My next question, I actually have two questions, sorry for that.
You're permitted, that's fine.
My next question is, I know that the next policy of the US government is going to be to secure the region and then to provide economic help to the people of a certain district or a province. And how will this help happen? Is it going to go through the corrupt NGOs, as I call, that have looted the money of the West and has been pouring back to the West through these NGOs, or is it going to happen through other types of strategies that the US government has taken in play, has thought about? Thank you.
Sikandar, thank you, and thanks for that question. Here's how we'd like to proceed. If we let everyone answer the first two questions, that would be the only question asked. So I'm going to ask one, maybe two people to ask each question so we can get as many as 10, 15, 20 questions in. We have an hour and 21 minutes. So the first question seems to me maybe Ron and Ahmed might be well placed to begin there.
I feel this elbow from Ahmed saying he wants me to start. I'm going to do then a little bit on the first piece, because Ahmed can really talk about that also. That is what negotiations are about, what they could be about. They don't exist, really. And a little more about the aid side. I know that there is an enormous nervousness in Afghans, among many Afghans, when one talks about negotiations, that it brings to many minds deals made in the past which were broken. Sides, people changed sides. Taliban, others who have used deals to strengthen their own position territorially. Ahmad Shah Massoud did it in the Panjshir. Others have done it. Strengthened their own position while there was some kind of an arrangement only to attack later. And that scares Afghans. Can no longer speak for the U.S. government, but I think the policy has really not changed. President Obama has been very clear. What he is talking about, what we are talking about, is still some form of accommodation which brings people into an existing political system, may modify it in some way to let them compete, but is not the granting of territorial control as a negotiated outcome, which I think scares many Afghans. I hope that remains the position, because I do not think there is a stable basis on which to simply give positions, ministries, and territory without having that break down, as every single such arrangement has broken down in the past, including those within the Mujahideen government. A lot of the civil war began from arrangements like that. But these are very early days. I think Afghans should express their nervousness, but they should not assume that we're all going to rush out and be stupid. Although it is not impossible. Secondly, there is an evolution going on in aid. There are a number of things. I did want perhaps to say something on this. There are a lot of mistakes, there's no question. When you take very large organizations in very large governments and you put them in a situation where you want them to act very quickly in situations of great confusion and limited capacity, the wonder is going to be that there are not more mistakes. But criticism is a little bit cheap. And with all respect to Dr. Malakas, I enjoyed the lecture, and a great deal of what you said is, of course, true. But you did profit a bit from the ability to use humor, use exaggeration for humor, and it is more fun than dreary detail. But I would note that you took a picture, you said you drove to the Panjshir. You drove to the Panjshir on a road we built, and not just one we paid for. I promised that road the first time I flew to Ahmad Shah Massoud's memorial service in the Panjshir, and I drove that road the second year to the same memorial. You led a university that has existed for a number of years on very limited life support from the U.S. government. It would not have existed this long had there not been U.S. aid. Now, that aid is not to build a university, it's to give it life support while the Afghan founders go out and do their job to find the private financing to build the university, and I know you worked very hard on that issue. So I acknowledge many of the criticisms. There is now an evolution. Every good idea comes with a price. The aid that is going to go into Marja initially is probably going to be heavily funded by the military, and that'll be direct construction. It won't go to anybody. I mean, they'll build stuff, some of which will be good, some of which will be wasted. There is an effort now to create more Afghan capacity, to put more money through Afghan, both trust funds at the top and local organizations. I think the challenge for us will be to define standards of success which are not simply how many projects fail. Because if you do more local NGOs, more Afghans, more government, you will also have more failures. It won't just be the corruption of the large foreign NGOs, but at the same time, if you don't do that, you won't expand capacity. So we have to be willing to have failures.
Ahmed.
Again, I well understand that, educated Afghans who've been in exile for so many years, coming back, wanting to see the end of the Taliban, trying to rebuild their country, are deeply concerned about this idea of negotiations. But my message to them, and what I spoke about earlier, was simply that Afghanistan and Afghan civil society cannot develop in the middle of an insurgency and a state of war. We need to bring this war to an end. That's the bottom line. We need to bring this war to an end, not by a surrender or by immediately leaving or by a collapse of the Afghan government, but we need to bring this war through negotiations. And my second point to make is that there have to be red lines drawn, and certainly a overarching red line is that the progress achieved by the Afghan people in the last 9 years, with the help of the international community, cannot be rolled back by Taliban or by compromises with the Taliban. And that includes things like education, health, women's empowerment, and a whole host of other things. So I think if we look at it, bringing the war to an end and not rolling back the achievements of what we've achieved, I think that is, and then of course states will have other things like Al Qaeda and what to do with global terrorism and all the rest of it. But I think for the Afghan people, these should be the two benchmarks. On the aid thing, I have long been an advocate of drastically reforming the governmental aid agencies like AID, the British, the problem in this post-Cold War world is we have yet to find or discover a way in which aid can be delivered by civilians in the midst of an insurgency. We do not want to hand the development and aid process over to the military. This completely contradicts what the whole meaning of civil society is all about. It contradicts what, the whole effort of international civil society and local civil society. At the moment, this failure to be able to reconstruct the aid process, unfortunately, has led to the military becoming a huge. Now, all the colonels and captains and majors are supposed to build bridges and roads and do all this kind of stuff, which is really not their job. They should provide the security for that, and they should. But we still do not have a process or an agency, either in the United States or in Europe or anywhere else, where things can be built in the midst of an insurgency.
Thank you. Whit and perhaps Cynthia might have something to say about this second question. How do you best deliver aid or help people with all this money that we have?
I have something to say about the first question, and nothing much to say about the second. With regard to
so much for organization.
With regard to the
that's what we love about Whit.
With regard to the Afghan response to the notion of negotiations with the Taliban, I would say which Afghans? The further south you go and the more Pashtun you go, the greater the acceptance of that notion. The further north you go, especially across the Hindu Kush, the less, because they remember last time when the Taliban arrived, in effect, religiously extreme, yes, but ethnically ferocious, really ferocious. And nobody up north except the Taliban Nolkarin, whom I described yesterday, the settlers, the Taliban, the Pashtun settlers up north, want them back. And this time, I think, unless the terms of negotiations are very carefully circumscribed in advance, this time I think there'll be civil war, and I suspect that part of it may be led by Hamid Karzai's vice president, Field Marshal Fahim, who commands the Panjshiri faction of what is left of the never very allied Northern Alliance. But they have their weapons, and they're not going to take it sitting down again. So the negotiations have to be very carefully circumscribed at the outset in order for the people who are not Pashtuns to accept even the notion of them.
Thank you. Cynthia, on the second question, do you have any thoughts?
Just a couple of quick things. It was said earlier today, and everyone knows this, it is obviously a much more helpful thing to teach people to fish than delivering the fish. But Afghanistan, I believe, has suffered from something that actually Africa has as well in terms of international and U.S. aid over the last decade. There was a turning away from agriculture for a whole lot of reasons. It was not sexy and interesting, and it didn't deliver very quick results. And so people who were under pressure in their jobs at the World Bank and other places to be able to show after a year what they had done, notwithstanding the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, as in Afghanistan, even more higher, 90, 80% of people, of the economy of people working comes from agriculture. They turned away from agriculture, and most of the money went to urban programs. That shift has now turned back globally as well as in Afghanistan. And you have some very interesting, innovative partnerships, such as, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation partnership around agriculture. It's not, to my knowledge, in Afghanistan yet. I might be wrong about that. Maybe they can be persuaded to look at Afghanistan. But it's a recognition that health begins, obviously, with eating. And it's a very sensible partnership. So I hope that Afghanistan is going to benefit from a general, totally common sense return to agriculture as the main delivery mechanism of aid. And there is, I can't say who's doing it, but there is a movement underway from some leading figures in Afghanistan to take this over themselves and actually run a significant agriculture aid program by Afghanis in Afghanistan. If that gets off the ground, I think it'll be very helpful.
Thank you. We have a question from Belfast or Rockland. Question from Peter McSpadden in Rockland. If uncoupling the Taliban from al-Qaeda is a good idea, what is the priority to encourage it? Are there specific actions that are now in place now? And I don't know, Paul, Larry, if you have thoughts on this. Ahmed?
I think most of the reasons to hope for a decoupling do not flow from anything we would do specifically. I tried to speak yesterday about the basic interests of the Afghan Taliban, which are very much different from those of al-Qaeda. There was considerable friction, even developing while al-Qaeda was still the guest of the Afghan Taliban in the past. So my main concern would be avoiding anything that we do that could be counterproductive and that would slow down the natural division between these two parties.
Larry.
I guess I'm supposed to share these, Mike. I would say that, that tactically, you know, there have been efforts to go after senior leaders in both of these organizations, but that the concept of Taliban and al-Qaeda, they do have different interests. They do have different orientations about what their ultimate goals and audiences are. But they're part of a broader Islamist militancy that exists throughout the region, albeit al-Qaeda is essentially an Arab-led movement that has sort of taken refuge and rooted itself in the region. So really, the underlying question is, how do we change that orientation? Pakistan was created as an Islamic homeland for the Muslims of South Asia. So the question of what kind of Islam should exist in that country has always been kind of a big underlying question. And out of a whole series of historical events, you have this sort of fringe Islamist element that now exists within that country. And it's been there that you've had the refuge and the sanctuaries that Ahmed Rashid has talked about. So there does need to be an uncoupling, but I think what really needs to happen, even more than that, is a rejection of militant Islamism. And that's a debate that's underway, you know, within Pakistani society. And as Paul says, to answer the question, probably the best thing we can do, short of, you know, quiet supporting of various folks offering alternative views to the population is to stay out of it and try to allow the more moderate folks of Pakistan, which is the vast majority, and of Afghanistan to carry that debate forward.
Thank you. A question here.
Judy Stein, Belfast. Nick, you reminded me that when Bob Kaplan spoke here in 2004, he spoke about the military, in part he spoke about the military being our first line as we are out dealing with counterinsurgencies, and the importance of that military operating, if you will, in a more civilian way in dealing with the people on the ground. And we've talked about that here as well, and any number of speakers about the importance of the small steps in meeting people where they are. Is there a shift in the manner in which the military is on the ground, and do we think that that's helpful?
Thank you very much. And if I could just add to your question, in addition to that question, I mean, the military is much more involved in what the military calls civil affairs, because it has to, because of the lack of capacity in state and AID, has been for the last 15 years. But the second question that maybe Tazy and others might look at is, shouldn't the State Department and aid be rebuilt so that the military doesn't have to play that role to a significant degree? And that is underway. It was started by President Bush and it's been continued by President Obama. So on this question, maybe Tazy, I'll go to you first. And Cynthia might have a word on this. And I don't know, Paul or Larry, if you do as well.
I think the answer is both of the above. The military has resources and has tremendous capacity to move rapidly in times of crisis. And this has led the military to take on very important roles in disaster relief. And I offer you the example of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean about 5 years ago that devastated Aceh in Indonesia and devastated much of Sri Lanka, and also struck in various other places, Thailand, the east coast of India, and so on. The U.S. military and the Indian Navy were two of the forces that were quickest on the spot. Without their being there as military, and without their, in some cases, bringing along some civilian help, our response would have been much delayed. That is very desirable, but it is, in my view, essential that the military not be the only game in town on that kind of urgent civilian work, and that particularly where you don't have the crisis and the time dimension, that the U.S. government expand its capacity to respond. This means, I think, two things. First of all, it means increasing the talent and staffing levels in somewhat different ways in both state and the Agency for International Development. Our aid agency has wonderfully talented people, but the nature of their talents has shifted over the years. They used to have engineers and agronomists and family planning doctors and nurses. They now have people who have some kind of field knowledge of these issues, but whose job is basically contracting. I'm oversimplifying, which makes it automatically slightly unfair, but actually not very unfair. I think AID needs to get back to where its roots and its heart are, and disaster relief and civilian reconstruction in tough environments would be a great place to start. They actually have started. They have something called the Office of Transition Initiatives, which has started to make a specialty of what they call post-conflict reconstruction. They have worked in Sri Lanka. They've worked in a number of other places. Afghanistan really hasn't been ripe for them because they're not post-conflict. They're in the middle of conflict.
Thank you. Cynthia?
A Pakistani-American friend has said to me, in fact, very repeatedly has said to me, that the single best image from America that he has ever seen in Pakistan was a news spot of an American soldier who was there after the earthquake. And there was an image on the news of him holding children, helping people who'd been injured in the earthquake. And somebody asked him a question: what are you doing here? And the soldier said, I am trained to fight and kill, and I am also trained to do this kind of work, and I much prefer this kind of work. And he said that was the single best thing anyone had ever seen. In the area of cultural diplomacy, the Defense Department has astonishingly large resources, and they are using them, I think, intelligently. I'm aware of some music-based initiatives in West Africa that are quite extensive. They seem a very intelligent approach there. The only problem is, does that make sense for that to be coming out of AFRICOM? And we all heard Secretary Gates' speech in Kansas when he talked about the importance of increasing diplomacy. But as far as I know, that speech has not yet been followed by a check.
You go where the money is to some extent.
A 10-second intervention by Larry.
Yeah, I just want to announce, I mean, not announce, it's underway, that we've developed in the Department of Defense, when General McChrystal went out there, not just with the Department of Defense, but this focus on what they're now calling the Afghan Hands Program, or the Afghan-Pakistan Hands Program, to develop the expertise, to not send, the military talks about 8 one-year wars rather than the 1 8-year war that the public sees, so that when people come back from a deployment, they continue to work on Afghanistan, they deepen their understanding. They work on the staff on Afghanistan, then they go back again, hopefully to the same area, and they work there again. And so I do think, to answer the question, there has been a change in the way we're trying to think about the operational and the tactical approach beyond the things I said yesterday.
Question in the balcony.
Thank you. My name's John Davidson. I'm from Camden. And first I want to say what a great conference this has been. And you all, the speakers and the moderators, done a great job, I think, in presenting information. And it should go a long way in helping educate the public so that we can help our elected officials make the right kinds of decisions. I'm an optimist by nature, and so therefore I hope that the vision that you laid out is one that's followed. But I'm really an economist. And as an economist, I'm concerned about the 1/3 of the GDP of Afghanistan being the poppy production. And I've not heard from anybody what kind of natural resources or human resources are available there that likely could be developed to replace that.
Let me ask Dr. Malakis and Samina maybe to talk about what's the human capital, and also what's the opportunity maybe to develop from within economic growth in both, I would say, both Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's hard to divide them on this question.
Well, I can try. I'm no economist, but what I can say is that clearly what is necessary is the creating of an entrepreneurial spirit, one that allows the creation of jobs. And therefore, the crux is indeed human potential, more than anything. So education, and education for employment is, I think, essential to that. It seems to me, furthermore, that the traditional subsistence economy has been allowed to wither, that agriculture proper has not been looked into. And I think immense progress can be made in terms of techniques of packaging, creating the sorts of roads that will take the produce to market. I mean, there's some of the best fruit in the world is grown in Afghanistan, and it rots on the vine because because it can't be transported to market. Kabulis eat Pakistani fruit because it's easier to bring it up along the Jalalabad road than it is to bring it down from where it grows around the corner. There are natural resources. There's a huge copper mine that the Chinese have just started to develop. There are large known gas resources in the north that used to be tapped that are now sort of in suspense. There could be other resources that can be developed. I think the important thing is to create alternatives, and there have been successful programs. Turkey is a good example of how you move away from opiates to other cultivations, but you have to keep the farmer in the center of the image, and you have to create a genuine post conflict economy. I mean, at this point, we're really talking about a war economy in which the link between the necessary protection you buy and the possibilities of development occur. Pakistan is, I think, in a very different condition. I think there we're talking about a very much more developed human potential. I think you're talking about a very much larger country. Some of the things that you see in Afghanistan, again, are marked Pakistani. This is a very curious phenomenon in that say, carpets made in Afghanistan are smuggled into Pakistan and then exported as Pakistani products. You'll find even in stores, you can find, maybe I have one in my pocket, work that is done, handiwork done by women, said, done by Afghan women, product of Pakistan. So it is a very different situation. Again, Pakistan has a harbor. Coming from a shipping nation, I can tell you it's the second worst harbor in the world, just after Lagos. I mean, you don't want your ship to go there unless you want to park it. But it has access to the water, which Afghanistan does not. Again, I cannot imagine a truly viable Afghanistan until some kind of alternative access other than through Pakistan, where the interests are complex, such as the harbors on the Persian Gulf through Iran, but that of course would require a complete restructuring of the regional policies. And again, the transport ways from Central Asia through to the world markets by sea involve so many political hurdles that one can hope, but it will take a lot of work, a lot of care, a lot of patience to realize.
Thank you. Dr. Samina Qureshi.
Once again, I turn to women. I think that the domestic realm can be turned into small industry. I think that, as we have heard, that women are off limits. It's very difficult to deal with this with respect, but empowering women and giving them the ability to practice the craft that they all know natively, the carpets, the embroideries, the weavings, these are small things. They are very small, but using the Grameen Bank example, it can grow exponentially. I also believe that attaching craft and the ability to have the smallest economic impetus encourages education, in learning more and wanting to enhance that productivity. So I would look at human capital with a special emphasis on women in the creative fields and in the arts and crafts to begin a movement of this so that the goods made by them are labeled by them and not pirated. They are pirated because they are valuable.
Brief interventions by Ahmed and by Taisi.
I just want to say that Afghan farmers do not want to grow poppy. They don't want to grow poppy. If you give them something else to grow, they'll grow it, which gives them an income. The tragedy has been that in 9 years, we have not given them an alternative crop to grow. The livestock that has disappeared, the fruit trees that have disappeared, we have not nurtured Afghan agriculture for 9 years. It's been our fault that this opium thing is going on. If you ask the majority of farmers, they would much rather grow something else. And that means investment in agriculture, which is finally happening. As far as, Samina's point about women is concerned, women's empowerment in Afghanistan, I think, is through work. If you look at the teaching sector or the health sector, which is dominated heavily by women, often in this situation, the women who are working as teachers or as nurses are actually the only bread earner in the family. And it completely alters the balance. The husband is jobless. The woman comes home puts the bread on the table. It completely changes the internal balance of society, and there's just enormously more respect for women. So I think the empowerment of women and making women work is the way, is the way to go. You don't need sort of feminist tracks and all that kind of thing. What you need is getting women into the workforce. And that changes the equation immediately.
This question has spawned a lot of comment Tazy.
At least one, and I think both, of the big Bangladeshi non-government organizations that put microcredit and microcredit for women on the global map are working in Afghanistan. One is BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, and the other is the Grameen Bank.
I know Nick's afraid of how long I'll talk, but agriculture, everybody's right. There is some progress. I just want you to understand the time required, because people will talk about a crop substitution, and it's the creation of a value chain. Yeah. When I first visited a farmers cooperative that we were funding through an aid program outside Jalalabad, they were already growing beautiful fruits and vegetables, look like what you'd find in your supermarket. Took about 2 years before we got the Serena Hotel in Kabul to buy those fruit and vegetables instead of shipping from Dubai. But the reason is not because they're stupid or hard-edged, it's because they want a box of tomatoes to show up every Monday that looks the same, and they want to be guaranteed that it's there. That means there has to be established cold storage, so you don't have to ship the product the day you pick it. You have to have proper packing. You have to teach people to do that. You have to get into wholesaling. That stuff is coming. I think we need, I totally agree we haven't done enough. I tried to do more and didn't get the money. But I totally agree with it. I just want people to understand why there's a time lag. There is a lot of unexplored potential. Some of it may not work. There is a lot more, we know there are a lot more structures for gas and oil, especially in the north, because of studies we did through USGS. We don't know how many of those are actually commercially viable. Next piece is the Afghan government has to put in place a structure of bidding that attracts foreigners, and it has to be transparent. We know there are jewels, people have talked about that, emeralds, lapis, others, mined for centuries, all the value addeds outside. Two big additional things, roads and power. People have to be able to get crops to market. Government has to be able to move, and we have to do roads all over the country, not just where there's a war. And cheap power. We can create, they can create a lot of jobs processing agriculture, but only if power comes down. It's not just getting the crop to market. Power is 6 times more expensive in Afghanistan, where they truck diesel fuel, than it is in Pakistan and Iran. So until you bring the price down, they will continue to raise tomatoes and import tomato paste. And we've done some on that. We haven't done near enough. We have to do more.
And it's important to note that the U.S., the EU, and Japan, and others built this ring road. We've been to Afghanistan from Kabul to Kandahar to Herat and all the way around to Kabul. Extraordinary achievements. The kind of infrastructure that we've been focusing on, that has been at least a success. I think the whole panel wants to jump in here. You understand?
Very, very quickly, on the issue of whether Afghan farmers want to grow poppies. They don't, but it's not exactly because they can't grow anything else. It's because everybody else is growing poppies. And in order to keep pace economically, you do too. Otherwise, you fall behind economically, and then you're in bad shape locally. The wheat, which is the mainstay of Afghan agriculture, is still there to grow. The melons are still there to grow. As Ahmad Rashid says, there's been some destruction to the irrigation systems, to the orchards. But the Afghans can bring that kind of thing back. The problem is, once a poppy economy gets going and the rewards are, never mind the fact that the farmers don't get most of it, they get a lot more than they do growing wheat. And once it gets going, then who's going to say, oh no, I'm not going to do it?
Well, but they are moving back the other way. They are responsive to prices. Poppy has gone down this year. Wheat has gone up. That's the good news. Bad news is it has nothing to do with our policy. It has everything to do with price. There are areas outside Jalalabad where farmers are making more on vegetables, but only where they're close enough to get them to town and only where they've got water. And out in Achin, there's not. It's exactly as you described. So I think it's not going to, I don't mean we're going to get a quick victory here, but I'm just saying we are seeing this year if you look at David Mansfield's detail work,
a lot of willingness of Afghan farmers to be price responsive, but we're not doing near as much as we could do to work on that.
Peace on the panel, good. We have a question from Belfast. Rick McDowell, after 8.5 years of international economic investment in Afghanistan, is it realistic to anticipate a surge in the development and economic funds necessary to stabilize and move Afghanistan forward? Who would like to address this question?
I've talked too much, otherwise I'll do it.
I think what you just heard are potential ingredients in that kind of a surge. But I think you also have to go back to the basic principle that any number of my colleagues on the panel have enunciated. It's about security in the first instance.
And about time.
And one of the people yesterday, one of the students asked about what can Europeans do if they're not willing to put their troops into combat. One of the things that I think our government has been trying to get the German government to do, the French government, the Spanish, can you contribute then more euro, billions more, on this economic side of the equation? If you can't send your troops into combat, can you take some of the slack up on the economic side? That's at least one step. Any other thoughts on the panel? Larry?
I just want to say very, very quickly that the way this normally works, and I certainly defer to our senior diplomats who know this better than I do, is that there are a lot of pledges, and then there's a certain amount of donation short of the pledges that actually comes in. What's that?
Not paying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And all of that is attached to the political realities, as we discussed before, and as Ambassador Newman was just saying, to the ticking clock of public disinterest. And I would also just very quickly echo what Ahmed was saying a little earlier about the way the aid mechanisms are structured in the West that tend to shape the way the aid comes in and the way it's dispersed and allows people to perceive it as basically lining NGO pockets or Afghan government pockets or whatever. And so all of that would force me to answer the question, no.
Thank you. Yes.
My name's Emily, and I'm a student from UMaine. And my question is everyone keeps saying that we have to be in Afghanistan for a long time to make it a victory. So how long do you guys think that would be? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years to make it a victory or stabilize, make it stable for everybody?
Paul, do you have a sense of that?
It's an excellent question because it is one that almost never gets answered, either officially or unofficially, with regard both to the length in years and with regard to the total cost in dollars or lives. All I can go on is a sense of what those who are more expert in counterinsurgency than I have said, and what the official doctrine, as enumerated in General Petraeus's manual, says. And given the magnitude of the task, if you're really talking about something that could be described as victory in counterinsurgency, I think the time frame to which you alluded, getting into approaching, if not reaching, double digits in years, is what we're talking about. Clearly, we are not talking about that in terms of the tolerance of the American public. But I'm glad you asked the question because that's the part of the cost side of the equation that too often is not specified in these debates.
I would just offer, just look at historical comparisons. We're still in Germany and Japan 65 years after the war, Second World War, with significant troop commitments. We're in Korea with 37,000 troops 60 years after that war. We're still in Bosnia, our economic commitment and the European military commitment 15 years after that war, and still in Kosovo 11 years after that war with American European troops and commitment. These things do take time if you want to finish and consolidate extraordinarily difficult challenges. Just some tasty.
But in none of the places that Ambassador Burns just mentioned do we have a war going on. At some point, the presence becomes peaceful, and the primary continuing input becomes economic, and you have a really very different character of our presence.
You still have troops, but they're there as part of an alliance or a peacekeeping, but the action shifts to the economic side. Good. Yes? Right here.
Joanne Bander, Sprucehead. Bringing it from the institutional level, I'd like to pick up on that issue of the corrupt NGO. If individuals in this room wanted to help with the economic and human development in Afghanistan and Pakistan in a very direct way, Camille Bank has been mentioned, et cetera, what do you see as viable options at the individual level to help transfer some immediate resources that can help with development?
Samina, Cynthia, Ron, Ahmed may all have thoughts on this.
A very quick one. There are a tremendous number of small-scale, not so small-scale NGOs, foreign NGOs working in Afghanistan. There are at least 2 books out there. One is called 101 Ways, I think, to Help Afghanistan. The other one, I think, is Afghanistan in Transition, which Cynthia Firestone published, which is a rather lavishly illustrated, privately published compendium of NGOs. Those are both good. There are others as well, but those are both easily available resources if you're interested in being involved to look at a staggering variety of projects that Americans and other NGOs and Afghans are involved in collectively, in education, in agriculture, in security, in health, in women, child, maternal health, all kinds of stuff.
Go ahead.
You want to look at what kind of capacity an NGO has to do stuff, and then there's a separate question of what kind of scale they operate at. I know the Pakistani scene a bit better than the Afghan one. The capacity is not actually all that hard to find. The scale is rare. The Aga Khan Foundation is one of the relatively few organizations in Pakistan that has both. But it's not easy to figure out where you want to put your individual efforts because the challenge of getting stuff done is considerable. And you know, there's a reason why the Western NGOs have had such a high profile. They are in a position, because of their source of support, to hire mostly, I would say, relatively good people to carry out their projects. This is one of the reasons they get criticized for keeping all the money in the United States or wherever, because that's where they find their staff. And it's a much greater effort involved if you're going to cultivate local staff, and of course there's a cost to that, as Professor Moulaki's reminded us, that if you cultivate local staff, you're probably hiring them away from local institutions.
Cynthia.
I'll use the opportunity to quickly plug an extraordinary Afghani woman who I know, Sakina Yacobi. I cannot remember the name of her literacy project, but she has run it throughout the whole Taliban period and, you know, into now. Also, the other program mentioned is great, and I can't remember the name of that if you want to say, but Sakina Yacobi, Jacobi, first name Sakeena, extraordinarily courageous woman. Has done amazing things for women in literacy there.
Samina, did you want to?
Yes, I would just like to say that working directly with local partners is a way that individuals can make a difference rather than contributing to big foundations that have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of overhead. One such that I have mentioned in my talk yesterday is Shirkat Ka, a local Pakistani organization, which means the place of participation. It is run by women. It's in all of the major places in Pakistan, and it concentrates its work on human rights, on honor killing, and on getting education compulsory for women in rural areas. Look it up, it's on the net, and it is the smallest contribution there will make a huge difference in a woman's life in Pakistan.
Thank you very much.
SHIRKATGAH. It has a very extraordinary website. You may find that easily.
Thank you, Samina. We have a question from Belfast or Rockland. From Lloyd Brace in Rockland, it looks as if the price of oil is going to rise at least over the next 4 years. How might that influence the U.S. decision to carry on in Afghanistan? So what's the link between the price of oil, Paul, and whether or not we stay in Afghanistan?
To the extent it has any effect, I would presume it would be a net minus with regard to sustaining political support for the expenditure of resources. The only way it can work in the other direction is pertinent to the question that was asked earlier today about Afghanistan being part of perhaps future development of oil and gas resources involving those of Central Asia. But that is so far in the future. So many other problems, security problems, would have to be solved before we could see any payoff in that I would say if it's any effect at all, it's a net negative, but I wouldn't expect the effect to be very great one way or another.
Larry, do you agree with that?
I agree. I think it primarily will have an effect possibly on domestic economic conditions here. And as we all know, when unemployment is high here, when we're suffering here, we don't care so much about what's going on in places like Afghanistan. So I would agree.
Question here. Yes.
I'm Robert Azzi. I'm asking, I think, primarily for you, Ambassador Burns and Ambassador Schaefer. I'm curious about the nuclear agreement with India and its relation to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and how that affects how we treat Pakistan and their nuclear capability and Iran and its nuclear ambitions, and whether or not we have, and I understand the reasons for doing it, and I think I approve of it, but I think it adds a dynamic when we're trying to get the other two people to pull back. Have we introduced a factor in the negotiations that perhaps was premature? Secondly, I just want to add a note, and it doesn't really need to be addressed, which is we've talked about social and economic and political and cultural aspects, and yet we've been hearing Islamist and jihadist and so on, and we haven't had anyone address the sort of theological and traditional underpinnings of what's driving the Taliban in both Pakistan and India.
Well, let me be merciful and just take a brief amount of time on the first one, because I think the second one's an interesting question too. And I'm hardly objective about this. I was the U.S. negotiator for that agreement over 3 years. And essentially this, we had sanctioned India for 35 years because it developed a nuclear weapons program outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Only the 5 permanent members of the Council are allowed to be nuclear weapons powers. We sanctioned them from the Carter administration through the beginnings of the George W. Bush administration, and the sanctions policy did not work. And so I do think that President Bush and Secretary Rice kind of faced the question directly and said, does it make sense to continue a policy that is absolutely not going to have an impact on the Indians? Or do we try to adjust it and just essentially try to bring the Indians into the non-proliferation system? So I was asked to negotiate that agreement. What does it give us? For the first time, and here's the basic deal. We said we'll take the sanctions off India, the United States, and we'll convince the 45 other members of the nuclear suppliers group in the world to take their sanctions off, in return for which India will submit itself to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to have all of its nuclear power plants in the future under inspection. They were not under inspection, not under international regulation. India has agreed to that deal. Right now, 14 of its 22 power plants are under and are coming under IAEA inspection, and all future breeder reactors go under inspection. What do we get from that? We get an India now that's more inside the NPT. It was outside. We send a signal to Iran and North Korea that a country that plays by the rules and safeguards its nuclear material, India didn't do what Pakistan did in letting its nuclear technology out on the black market, will be rewarded. And we've taken potentially the largest country in the world, India will surpass China in population in about a decade, and put it into the system and made it part of the system, and it was outside before. Our companies will now sell nuclear power plants, Russian companies, French companies. At a time of global climate change, India is right now deriving about 3% of its energy from nuclear power. In the future, in a generation, that could go up to 20 to 25%. A difficult deal. And a lot of people think it weakened the NPT. I think it's going to strengthen the NPT. We had a battle over 2 years in the Congress to approve it, but Senator Biden, Senator Clinton, and Senator Obama all voted for it in 2006, and they all support it now. Obviously, I'm biased, but I think it's a very good deal for the United States and for the rest of the world. Taisy's more objective.
Well, I'm not sure I am, because I've been a supporter of the deal, but I would make one additional point that I think is two additional points that I think are important. First of all, I would like to draw a distinction between the Non-Proliferation Treaty and non-proliferation policy. The U.S. has for years maintained a non-proliferation policy which was more stringent than was required by the treaty. For example, we prohibited ourselves from civilian nuclear cooperation with any country that did not accept full-scope safeguards, meaning safeguards on every nuclear facility in the country, not just the facility with which we proposed to trade. So that the action we took in concluding a nuclear deal with India poked a big hole in global non-proliferation policy as it was then understood, but I would argue did not, in fact, violate the treaty. The reason that Nick had such a tough job negotiating was, of course, that we wanted to keep faith with the treaty, whereas India wanted to demonstrate that it was being treated as the full equivalent of a treaty-recognized nuclear weapons state.
Which we did not do.
An easy combination to achieve. The second point I would make is that in addition to the strategic reasons which I think drove the administration and which Nick just articulated, there is another thing to consider, and that is what are the most urgent nuclear dangers today? And I think that one of the things in the back of people's minds, I wasn't one of the people, so I'm only guessing, was that nuclear leakage to dangerous recipients is a danger that we need to put closer to the top of our list than we did in the 1960s when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was concluded. The third point, of course, is Pakistan. This deal sticks in Pakistan's craw. They feel deeply discriminated against because India got what they would like to have, with the notable difference, of course, that Pakistan had been providing nuclear know-how to some of the worst recipients in the world. There has been occasional speculation that the U.S. might need to offer a Me Too deal to Pakistan. I don't even like to think about getting that through the U.S. Congress. I don't worry about how the Indians would react because I don't think you ever get to that point. But I mean, in particular, as long as the founder of their nuclear Walmart is around, I think that's not likely to happen. Pakistan, your question suggested that U.S. policy was designed to get Pakistan to give up its nuclear weapons. There would surely be rejoicing in Washington if that were to happen. I'll buy you a very expensive lunch if it ever does, though.
You really got us going with this question. I would just say two more brief things. There will never be such a deal with Pakistan until Pakistan becomes a more responsible country about its nuclear technology. The AQ-Con network did enormous damage in exporting through the black market their technology to the governments that are irresponsible. And secondly, what we effectively did was take the largest problem we've had with India for 3 decades and resolve it. India is now a strategic partner. That's very meaningful for us for the next 50 years as we have to deal with those balance of power questions regarding China that we talked about earlier, another benefit that was very much in our minds as we negotiated this particular treaty. Would you rephrase your second question? We've gone off on such a tangent that I'd like to give the panel a chance to hear it again.
Well,
that's okay, we can hear it. The acoustics are fine. I'll repeat it.
Is the
Okay, fair enough. So the question for the people in Belfast and Rockland who probably didn't hear it is, there's a religious element involved in the conflict in South Asia and Afghanistan in particular. Why haven't we emphasized that more in our discussion? This gives us now the opportunity to do that, Ahmed.
Well, this is a vast subject, and I could, go on about, what the Al-Qaeda believes in and what the Taliban believe in. But essentially, I think, there are 2 or 3 simple things that have been that have been perverted grossly as far as understanding of Islam is concerned. The first thing what Al-Qaeda does in this whole Salafi way of thinking is this whole concept of global jihad. There is no such concept in Islam. You don't go to war with the whole world. Jihad has very specific objectives and has very specific conditions. Secondly, the elevation of jihad, above all other Islamic precepts, which is what Al-Qaeda believes in. That, jihad is more important. We have 5 farz, which are 5, the 5 things you're supposed to be a good Muslim, you have to do 5 things, which includes prayer, fasting, going to do Hajj, and it includes jihad. But jihad is one of 5 other things. What Al-Qaeda and this philosophy has done is that they've elevated jihad to be the one and only thing that you are supposed to do. And anybody who doesn't believe in that, by the way, any Muslim who doesn't believe in that can be killed because he's not part of the belief. So there is this very extreme interpretation of Islam, and unfortunately, and they also support suicide bombing. And that's part of jihad. Well, suicide bombing is anathema in Islam. It is not possible to commit suicide and to be considered a Muslim, a pure Muslim. So, there are all these things. Now the Taliban do not believe in global jihad. They have been given suicide bombing as a kind of import, if you like, from Al-Qaeda, etc. And their jihad is very specific. It is to liberate Afghanistan as they see it and drive out the foreign troops. So there is quite a big difference in religious terms as to, between these 2 groups.
Athanasios?
Yes, I just wanted to go back to what little I know about Afghanistan. And I think it's important to start where Samina was, that is to say that there are many modes of Islam. It can be lived in so many ways. And I think, there is no question that Islam has been a very important factor in informing the dignity, the meaning, the justice, the order of Afghan society. But before the war, speaking 30 years ago, what you had on the whole in Afghanistan was what I would call Friday Islam. People would go to their mosque, they would do their devotions. The mullah was a figure of sort of, casual respect. But with the mobilization of the countryside, in opposition to intense centrifugation, intense Sovietization, the fight with the Soviet Union, you get this religious mode as a unifying ideology. So to oversimplify terribly, but nevertheless, I think, and I'd be happily corrected by people who know better, it seems to me that the war makes, that the jihad makes radicalism, not radicalism makes jihad, in terms of religious observance. That there is an upsurge of fundamentalist, or if you want, extreme non-orthodox in that sense, Islam, that sweeps aside prohibitions such as those of suicide, as a function of a mobilization and ideologization of society that comes with the war.
Thank you. We've got a number of questions left, but this is a very important issue. And I wonder if Samina and Ron wanted to say something briefly about it.
Religious illiteracy, it's a very, very important thing to think about, because the tenets of the religion, the basic ones that Ahmed was outlining, are just basic. Then there is the interpretation that Islam is a way of life. And this way of life is very flexible in different regions. Indonesian Islam is very different from the Wahhabi Arabian practice and all of these different manifestations, all of which are. So in this pool of ignorance. Islam appears as this monolith, and it's very easy to reduce it into this Al-Qaeda suicide bomber situation, all of which, according to the basic religion, is anathema and a sin. However, these Jim Jones, let me say, is not a Christian according to my understanding of the Christian faith. And there is that kind of illiteracy about Christianity also. And if you go back to the history of the Holocaust and all of that, there is all that illiteracy about the Jewish religion. So, you know, what is happening in the world today is that level of unfamiliarity causes these things to be collapsed into one kind of political philosophy, and it really has to be separated. It really has to be separated because there are many, many paths that lead to God, and it's a humane and compassionate God in the end that all of us believe in. People of the book, it's the people of the book, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. It's the children of Abraham, and that's important to remember also.
Thank you.
What I wanted to add is simply that when one looks at Afghanistan and the insurgency there, it is still my impression that religion and the violent extremist versions are not the primary motivator, except of a rather small group of ideologically committed leaders, and probably a bit more also in Hekmatyar's movement to some extent, which is the only movement that has had a certain amount of limited but still some success in winning adherents across ethnic lines. But most of the research I'm familiar with would validate something I saw back in 2006, where we managed to do some interrogation of prisoners taken in the offensive that summer and asked the question, why are you in the revolt? And the answers were interesting because the top three reasons were frictions between tribes, tribal frictions with the government, economics, and then religion ideology came in as rather a laggard fourth. It wasn't even a close competitor. That hasn't been repeated to my knowledge, but there have been some opinion surveys of Pashtuns on the border and things like that, which come out with conclusions that are a little different to the questions they've asked, but are rather similar in what they point to. So I think you certainly have a view that they're being religious, but and it's possible that irritation with foreigners, the occupation theme is gaining a bit of ground. I don't think a huge amount, but it is still, I think it's very important to understand that what we are dealing with in Afghanistan is only rather minimally at a top level an ideological religious struggle. And it's a mistake to portray the whole insurgency as though it were about religion.
Tacy and Paul.
I would like to reinforce that point in a different way. You're dealing with largely conservative rural societies, and by conservative I mean people whose natural instinct is to do things the way their parents did, obviously under pressure of massive social change. And a lot of social traditions in Pakistan and Afghanistan and in lots of other countries have acquired a kind of Islamic character in people's minds over the years. And I think this is how you reach the point that Samina was talking about, where people, and particularly where radical people who are trying to mobilize a society, describe as Islam some things that are basically local traditions, and they're fairly selective about which traditions they put into this. But that, to me, reinforces the point Ron made, that you're not looking in the first instance at an ideological struggle for most people.
Paul, final word.
Yeah, just to agree with and wrap up everything my colleague said and respond to the question why we hadn't talked more about theology. Theology per se with a capital T, I think, has relatively little to do compared with strategic, tactical, national orientation types of considerations with the sort of violent behavior that concerns us the most. And with regard to bin Laden and al-Qaeda, bin Laden's stroke of genius was a stroke of strategic genius, not theological, with regard to the idea of hitting the far enemy after earlier efforts to overthrow the near enemy, the Saudi government, the Egyptian government, failed. If you look at the ranks of international terrorists in al-Qaeda and other groups, there is not a wave of piety there. If anything, there's a remarkable divergence between the extreme behavior and a lack of religious observance. Jessica Stern recently had a piece in the Washington Post that addressed this very issue.
Thank you. That was a very, very interesting discussion. Thanks to all the panelists. And thanks for the question. We're going to Rockland or Belfast. Mary Trotteschot, Belfast. A joint report by 8 leading humanitarian organizations working in Afghanistan was critical of the International Security Assistance Force, NATO, because of, quote, the international military's use of aid as a non-lethal weapon of war. Can you speak to the blurring of the lines between nonpartisan humanitarian work and military-led humanitarian activities that are driven by political interests, and can you speak to its impact on the people of Afghanistan? Larry is perfectly in wit placed to answer this question.
Well, the reality is, this is in many ways a core question that we've talked about all weekend. Tazy Schaefer was talking about it a bit earlier, and so was Nick Burns, that we do these kinds of long-term post-conflict nation-building operations, if we can call them that, like we see in Germany and Japan and so forth as we walk through it. But those are post-conflict. This is in conflict. And the national security architecture that we set up in the 1947 National Security Act really, which is still sort of largely in place in many ways, really doesn't have, although we are developing it as my colleagues were saying, really doesn't have a way to do this very well. So the military has been the default provider because we're in conflict, and it's a reasonable concern, but it's not likely to change anytime soon. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but I don't know. Maybe Ambassador Newman can elaborate.
Whit's going to take a swing at this first?
I have an opinion here, and this opinion may rile some, including the person with the question. I hope not. But I'm a big fan in Afghanistan of what are called, the abbreviation, the acronym is PRT, Provincial Reconstruction Team, whereby about 100 military people from one country position themselves within a province and act as a kind of military safeguard and also civil reconstruction team. Initially, there were only 3 or 4. Donald Rumsfeld was against placement of these PRTs, provincial reconstruction teams, in all the provinces because he felt that their presence would somehow get in the way of our pursuit of al-Qaeda. I think they do wonderful work. They are, for the most part, well-funded and well-equipped, as our Western militaries tend to be. A number of them are American, by the way. They can accomplish great things, greater than most much less funded NGOs can accomplish. The NGOs tend to be staffed by very good people working for quite low wages of liberal sentiment. And I think they, consciously or unconsciously, I think they rather resent the fact that these PRTs are encroaching on what they perceive to be their territory. They say that it's very hard for them to work in the field when people in uniform, military uniform, are also working in the field, because there's confusion, identity there, identity confusion is what I mean to say, and they're liable to be understood as military and thus put at risk. And I can understand how they feel, but to be honest, in this situation, I think it's a gripe born partly of envy. And I support the presence of the provincial reconstruction teams. I only wish we had had them in more provinces earlier.
Ron, you and I have seen these teams in the field. My sense is Witt's sense that they've done a lot of good. Is that your judgment?
Yeah, but I think you could break the question down to think about it a little bit, because I think we blur some lines. There are really 3, maybe 4 situations. There's the military doing a variety of humanitarian and even getting into reconstruction aid, where the security situation is so tough nobody can work. There are some extremists who say that you simply shouldn't do it under any conditions, and I have very little patience for that view. There are situations in which the military is doing things which civilians could be doing physically in the area, and where some of the problem for the government side is that we lack the capacity, that there is an urgent need, and this is what we've experienced a lot of places, that we have simply not had within the U.S. government and within other governments the civilian capacity to stand up the work. Some governments have other problems, by the way. The British, for instance, under DFID, for the most noble humanitarian reasons, made it a law that DFID could only fund things which had projects which had a developmental aspect. But when they went down to Hillman and British soldiers were being killed, and they wanted DFID to be the agency to do projects to support, you know, better feeling and getting less people killed, they couldn't do it. That's a rationale that doesn't play too well with the military. Then you have the situation where the military is, because it has money and capability, doing things which frankly it doesn't do very well, and which the civilians have the capability to do, and the NGOs. And there, I think then you have a problem, and you do badly. And I agree with what Ahmed and others are saying. It's better if you do these things with people who actually know what they're doing, most of whom are civilians. There is in Afghanistan, about a year ago, there was a signed NGO between, a signed memorandum of understanding, sorry, between NGOs and ISAF to try to regulate some of this. I think one needs to look at different situations. One needs to be realistic. You know, the most extreme is the people who didn't want us to go to war in Afghanistan because we would create a humanitarian problem, even though if you left the Taliban in place, quite apart from Al-Qaeda, you simply carried on with the refugee problem and all the other bleeding wounds of the past. It was sort of, if if the military has to suture the wound, better to let it bleed and keep putting bandages on it. I am making an extreme statement, clearly, but you can tell what I think about that view. But there's plenty of room.
Okay. Thank you. Great question, Mary. Thank you very much. We've got 7 minutes and 15 seconds left. People want to go to lunch. We've got 3 questions that I see in the hall. Maybe 4. If we can have quick questions and very quick answers, maybe one of the panelists will get all of them in. Right down here.
Ward Wickwire, Lincolnville and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It seems that we've agreed that the possibility of getting much economic aid from a Washington that's beset with historic deficits and systemic unemployment is very remote. Mm-hmm. What are the chances for stimulating private investment from Washington into Afghanistan and Pakistan? And secondly, what is the possibility that those investments might be received warmly?
Tazy?
We actually have a lot of aid money that's likely to go to both Afghanistan and Pakistan, so I don't accept your first premise, at least in the short term. I think this is going to get more difficult. As far as private investment is concerned, the big barrier is security. And there has not been much U.S. private investment going into either Afghanistan or Pakistan. you're going to have a considerably more secure environment in order to change those numbers in any meaningful way.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
David, hello. David Terry from Rhode Island. This is a Pakistan question. With the military controlling so much of the economy and the government in Pakistan, and as Ahmed Rashid had indicated Friday night, there's a widening gulf here between the civilian and the military population, military. How do you see the relationship between these parties playing out, between the civilian and the military in Pakistan?
Thank you. Ahmed and Samina, perhaps.
In 15 seconds.
Well, you know, I mean, as I said, I think the gulf between the military's concept of the state and national security and the civilian concept of what the state should be doing in national security is actually widening. And this is why we are having increasingly, you know, a more disturbed political situation, you know, between the civilian government right now and the military. How, you know, you know, I asked this question, I mean, how do we bridge this gap? Is there going to be leadership from the civilian side or from the military? Are we going to get an enlightened army chief who's going to be able to bridge this gap and accept the fact that the army should come under civilian rule? Are we going to get an enlightened civilian leader which is going to, you know, bridge this gap? At the moment, I mean, you know, it's simply not looking good. All I can hope is that there's going to be, you know, the circumstances around Pakistan, if there's an Afghan settlement, if there are talks with India, if the army feels less of a physical threat from its so-called enemies, then maybe we can get some kind of agreement on having a common civilian and military agenda in order to build up the country.
Samina.
To that, I would add that the civilian and the military have to get together to understand and resolve the ambiguities in the regions. This business of the federal administered territories has to come under some sort of understanding with the sovereign entity of Pakistan. I think the equality of the regions has to be discussed and debated so that it can be adjudicated and create a sense of justice and fairness where people wish to belong to the political entity of Pakistan. These internal divisions have to be done internally. Nobody from the outside can come and arbitrate this dispute. But the awareness of this has to be raised by the citizens, by the people, and it has begun. So I'm optimistic that it will come to a situation of some resolution. But without that, you know, these pockets of things like Ahmed was describing in Balochistan will continue to tear the fabric of the state apart. And that is the danger.
What's after 15 seconds?
15 seconds. Allow me to recommend the writing, you can find it online, of a man called Vanni Capelli. Vanni, V-A-N-N-I, Capelli, C-A-P, I think there's only one P, E-L-L-I, who examines more succinctly than anybody I know what he calls the ongoing systemic pathologies of the state of Pakistan.
Question in the balcony.
Yes, my name is Ryan Buckley from the College of the Atlantic. In Mr. Rashid's book, he discusses the mistreatment of captured combatants and civilians in CIA-run black sites and other secret military prisons. Quite unfortunately, this had the unintended effects of playing into the hands of the extremists in the form of propaganda for recruitment, as well as justifying other regional actors to commit atrocities against their own citizens. In your opinion, what are the lasting effects of these policies, and how have they changed or not under the new administration?
It's a very important question. We have very little time left, but it deserves a good answer. I don't know if Ron or Paul want to speak to that.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think the ill effect is implied in your question, and it is a valid premise for the question. The current administration has attempted to make departures from some of the practices of the previous ones. As we well know from what we read in the press virtually every week on this or related issues, There are many in this country who do not think the current administration has broken as sharply as it ought to. Others on the other end of the political spectrum have had very harsh words to say in alleging that trying to differ from the previous administration's practices makes us insecure. I tend to agree in general with what the Obama administration is trying to do, which is to back away from some of the most costly or least cost-effective practices when it comes to handling of detainees, while recognizing that there are still some very difficult trade-offs and tough questions as to how to ultimately dispose of people, for example, against whom you might not have an immediate prosecutable criminal case. So in general, yes, there is a downside, but there are other important considerations on the other direction, and I think the current administration has been trying to play it about right.
In the 4 seconds available to us, you have the last words, last question with a brief answer.
A question for Paul Pillar and perhaps Ron Newman. Paul, I know you're not in favor of a rapid withdrawal, probably more of a rational drawdown of forces at some point, but is there a certain and substantial level of U.S. and NATO force required in Afghanistan, and to any extent they may be in Pakistan, to provide a way to contain the jihadist extremists?
In short, no. I would not define containing the jihadi extremist in terms of a particular troop level. And even if we're talking about the application of force, we are not talking just about troops on the ground. We are talking about other things such as the Hellfire missile strikes in northwest Pakistan.
I basically agree. I don't think you can talk about sort of indefinite combat forces. I think the first task is to plug a hole that we've allowed to grow while we carry out the decisions to make a proper-sized Afghan security force. As that force comes on, it has to take the lead. We have to be very careful that we put it in the lead, that we genuinely partner, don't just drag Afghans around with us while we conduct military operations. They have to take it on. I think they can take it on. Then, yes, you'll have a training support. I mean, if you're talking about helicopters, you're probably going to have somebody maintain them and help with that, but not combat forces indefinitely. And probably a lot of money, a long time. But then, as Whitney pointed out, and others, even under the Iron Amir, the Army was paid for by the outside. This is not necessarily an aberration in Afghan history or incompatible with stability.
Okay. One last question. Do we all feel better? Can you please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists?